the end of paper 2 for AQA A-level psychology, you might get asked a question that is to design a study for 12 marks. It's not guaranteed that you will get a question, a 12 marker, which is kind of annoying. It would be nice to know, wouldn't it, what we're going to get. But if you do get asked a design a study question for 12 marks, then it will either be for an observation or a correlation or for an experiment. I've made other teaching videos for the correlation and observation. So this video is about how to design an experiment, and you'll be given a stimulus which will probably be a follow-on from all the what have happened in the questions before this one. It might not, it might be something completely random, but quite often they'll give you a question that relates to all the other things that you've been looking at beforehand. So let's have a look at this question here. So you need to read the stimulus really carefully. So it says, previous research found that anxious people have poorer accuracy of recall for eyewitness testimony compared to non-anxious people. A psychologist wanted to find out if taking anti-anxiety medication would improve the accuracy of recall for anxious people. Design a study to investigate whether taking 20 milligrams of anxiety medication will make a difference to anxious participants' eyewitness testimony score. For your measure of accuracy of eyewitness testimony, you should devise a measure that would give data suitable for testing at the ordinal level of measurement. 30 patients attending an anxiety clinic are willing to be participants in your study. And then it gives you the question, like some bullet points. But what I want to say before we look at the bullet points is that how do you know that this is asking you to design an experiment? So you've got to really take notice of the wording of the question. This one says, design a study to investigate whether taking the medication will make a difference to anxious participants' eyewitness testimony score. The word difference is really important because when we're looking at a test of difference, we're looking at the difference between the conditions of the IV. If in the stimulus it talked about a relationship, see whether there's a relationship between taking medication and anxiety eyewitness testimony score, then that would be a correlation. But we're looking at the word difference. So it then gives you, it says in your answer you should provide details of, and it will give you a bulleted list. Now that bulleted list could be anything. And I've put down some things that are quite common for an experiment that might come up, but be aware that it might say other things. So it might say include details of the ethics, or include details including a hypothesis. So whatever is in the bulleted list is how you should focus your answer. Now this one says include details of the design, including reference to the experimental design, variables and controls. So there are 3 things there within that design that you must talk about. The next bullet, the materials, apparatus, procedure, describe the task, procedure and any specialist materials required. And the third bullet says data analysis that could be used, include reference to descriptive and inferential analysis. And then at the end it says justify your choices for 12 marks. So you read the stimulus and then you have to design a study from that, and I'm going to talk you through how to do that for this particular stimulus. So general information, just to say from the get-go, you will be awarded most of your marks for the bulleted information, but you will also get marks for being realistic and that the study could actually be implemented. So it's got to be cohesive, you've got to write in a coherent way, and you've got to be realistic. Most people forget to justify their choices. Now for a designer study you get 6 marks AO1, so 6 marks to describe what you will do, but you also get 6 marks for AO3, which we know is evaluation, but that basically means 6 marks to explain why you made the decisions in the first place. So I chose this experimental design and explain what that is, that would be at AO1, because, and then saying why you chose it, justifying why you chose it, is the AO3. So be aware that you must justify your choices. Number 4, you need to mostly write it in continuous prose. There will be some things that you can bullet and I'll explain when, but mostly you write it in a way that is continuous prose, so you're explaining what you would do. And people get a bit confused by this. I would just write it in the first person. I would be the psychologist and say, I'm going to design a study to investigate this, and then I will select this experimental design and explain, I will do this, I will do that. So write it in continuous prose. And the other thing to say is you can use the bullets as subheadings, and I think that will really help focus you and show the examiners where the marks are coming from as well. So the bullets, like, use that as a subheading, underline it, and then write underneath everything you need to. A lot of people get really stuck with how to start it. And so what I would do is right at the beginning, I would write a couple of sentences to set out what I intend to do. And that will help you and the examiner. So for example, in this study, I will compare the influence of anxiety medication on the accuracy of eyewitness testimony. Participants will watch a video of a violent crime and be tested on their accuracy of recall 48 hours later. Some participants will take anti-anxiety medication and others won't, in order to make a comparison. So it's just a couple of sentences to just kind of set out overall, like, what is going to happen. My biggest advice is keep it simple. Don't say you're going to test people over several weeks or give some people different amounts of medication, because it gets really complicated and it's unnecessary. And the other thing is, you don't need to take like baseline anxiety scores to start with. Everybody's got anxiety. We know that because they've been selected from a clinic. So you're just going to do the investigation and find out the influence of the medication. Okay, so the first bullet point, number 1, says design, include reference to the experimental design, variables and controls. I would write that, underline it, and although it says experimental design first, I would probably start with the variables. And so the variables for an experiment means that an experiment is a test of difference. So that means that we're going to be looking at the independent variable and the variables and the dependent variable, which as long as you've written it once, you can then just refer to as IV and DV. Really importantly, the IV and DV must be operationalized. And so operationalization, if you don't know what it is, look it up. It's really important. But if you operationalize something, then you are making it really specific and measurable, and it's also a kind of a measure of the wider construct. So the wider construct is, does anti-anxiety medication work? So our independent variables, we need to be very specific about exactly what the two conditions of the independent variable are, and again the dependent variable. So the IV and the DV are dependent on the task that has been set for the participants, and the task that I've kind of put across, which is really straightforward way of measuring it, is for participants to watch a video of a violent crime and then complete a questionnaire 48 hours later to test their accuracy of recall. Now the reason I've done that is because if you think back to the memory unit when you learnt about the cognitive interview, in the cognitive interview, participants were either given a cognitive interview, a hypnosis interview, or a standard police interview. And then 48 hours later they came back, or they watched a violent crime, came back, and then they were tested on accuracy of recall using one of the 3 interviews. And then you'll probably see, like, throughout a lot of investigations, people watch a video of something and then get tested on it. So that's a really easy way to do it, and that's what I've chosen to do. Now this particular stimulus, I made a specimen research methods past paper, and all the questions before this one were about anxiety and recall and things like that. So this was actually a follow-on from it, and in the original stimulus it talked about that exact task. So don't be afraid to borrow from tasks that have been put to you in the paper before the actual question. You don't have to reinvent the wheel, you just have to make sure that you are doing what you're meant to do. Okay, so so it says design, like, so variables, you need to state your IV and DV really clearly. So we've put there, independent variable is 20 milligrams of anxiety medication or a placebo 30 minutes before watching a video of a violent crime. Now I've put placebo, and I'm sure that you're aware that a placebo is like a fake medication, but you don't have to use placebo. You could have put 20 milligrams of anxiety medication or no medication 30 minutes before watching a video of a violent crime. Doesn't matter either way. Now I'm going to refer to the placebo all the way through, but as long as you've got one condition of the IV is taking medication and one condition of the IV isn't, either they're taking placebo or taking nothing, it really doesn't matter, it's fine. But you can see that that is operationalized. It's specified the amount of anti-anxiety medication and when they take it. And then the DV, the dependent variable, is the eyewitness testimony score after 48 hours. So again, that is operationalized. It's talking about a score and it's saying after 48 hours. Now, the reason I put eyewitness testimony score is because in the stimulus, it said that you had to create data suitable for testing at the ordinal level of measurement. Now, you should know that ordinal data means that it's numerical, but there's no specific unit of measurement. It's just a score. So imagine if you give someone a questionnaire and ask them to, like, questions about the video they saw. They might get a question right about what colour a car was, but they might get a question wrong about what colour jumper the mugger was wearing or whatever. So there's no real specific unit of measurement. It's not like time in seconds or height in centimetres. It's just the score that they've got. They've got some questions right and some questions wrong. We don't know what those questions are. We don't know how difficult each of the different questions were. We just know how many they've got right. So that's why that is ordinal data. It gives you a number, so you might get 6 out of 10 right or 20 out of 40 right or whatever, but it doesn't tell us anything else. So just a quick note there, you can credit all realistic tasks that measure accuracy of recall for eyewitness testimony. So you don't have to use the video of the violent crime, but whatever you do, make sure that the task is ethical, because it's got to be realistic. It's got to have got through an ethics board. So you can't get people to watch a real crime because that might traumatize them. So it doesn't, as long as you choose something that is measuring it, they'll be fine with it. Now, it doesn't ask you for a hypothesis, so you don't have to write a hypothesis, but if you are good at writing them, it might be an idea to write one after you put the variables, because it just really sets out to the examiner that you know, like, what your prediction is about what's going to happen. So the hypothesis here, the conditions of the IV are in red and the DV is in green. So it says participants who take 20 milligrams of anti-anxiety medication 30 minutes before watching a video of a violent crime will have a higher eyewitness testimony score than participants who take a placebo. And again, that one is exactly the same. It's just saying about people who do take medication or people who don't. So if it doesn't ask for a hypothesis, you don't have to. But if you've got time, then it might be an idea to do it, because it will really help you and the examiner see what you're trying to do. Okay, so the next thing in this first subheading, so the design. So you've done the variables, but it says include reference to the experimental design. Now, you should know that there are 3 experimental designs called independent groups, repeated measures, or matched pairs. And you have to choose which experimental design you want to go for. And you can go for any in this one. It really doesn't matter. Whichever one you choose will have implications for things like the control measures and the procedure. So choose one that you feel most familiar with. I'm going to talk you through each of them here. So you choose one, you explain what it is, and you justify why you've chosen it. So if you went for independent groups design, then you need to explain what it is. So all participants are randomly allocated to complete one condition of the IV. That's what it is. And then the justification for it. So you would say, I chose it because there would be fewer demand characteristics. So we know that demand characteristics are when people guess the purpose of the study and behave differently. Now, with independent groups design, there are fewer demand characteristics because people only do one condition of the IV, so they are less likely to guess the purpose of the study. Another good thing about independent groups is, like a justification, there are no order effects of boredom, practice or fatigue that you get with the repeated measures, because they're only doing one condition of the IV. They're less likely to get bored or practice their memory or get tired. The other benefit in this case of independent groups is that you only need to have one video of a violent crime. Now that's really good because it means both conditions of the IV can watch the same video. So that's really good for control because they're only doing one condition of it. So everyone has exactly the same video that they're going to watch. So you might have chosen that one, or you may choose repeated measures design, which is fine. So you say what it is. So in repeated measures design, all participants do both conditions of the IV. You might want to just put in there, that means they'll have anti-anxiety medication to watch one video, and no medication or a placebo to watch the other. And then the justification. So the good thing, what's good about repeated measures? So you're justifying, you're saying, well, I've chosen this because all participants act as their own control, which means there'll be no participant variables that could influence the DV, such as, and then you need to say what kind of participant variables would affect the DV, their accuracy of recall. So it could be things like their baseline anxiety level, their educational attainment, or their memory in general. So those are the participant variables that may impact on how good people's recall is. And so if you have repeated measures design, then people are in both conditions of the IV and those things won't affect it. The last experimental design you could choose is matched pairs. Now I always say to my students I'd avoid matched pairs like the plague because it's hard and it gets a bit complicated. But if you like it, then go for it, and there's no reason why you can't. So if you decided to choose matched pairs, you need to say what it is. So matched pairs design means that participants are matched on criteria that may influence the DV, such as their baseline anxiety level, their educational attainment, and their memory in general, as well as other factors like age and sex. Each matched pair is then randomly allocated to do one condition of the IV. So that's what matched pairs is. You'd have to explain that. And then the justification for it. Now it's a really great experimental design. So the good thing about it, you can say I've chose matched pairs because there are no order effects of boredom, practice or fatigue because they're only doing one condition of the IV. There are fewer demand characteristics because they're only doing one condition of the IV, and so they're less likely to guess the purpose of the study. There's also fewer participant variables. Now there's not none because they are different people, but there's fewer. You've matched them on so many things that actually it's less likely that their participant variables like their memory or their anxiety level in general is going to affect the DV. And another good thing about it is you only have to have one video of the violent crime because they're only doing one condition of the IV. So the matched pairs is like this, like all singing, all dancing experimental design, because it's basically got the benefits of both independent groups and repeated measures, but it is a bit complicated, and personally I wouldn't bother. I'd do one of the others. Okay, so design. So we've talked about the variables, we've talked about control, the variables, we talked about the experimental design. So the last part of this first bullet is the controls. Now, with the control measures, there are many control measures, and most of them depend on whether you choose independent groups, repeated measures, or matched pairs design. But, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but first of all, there is a control measure that you can use for any experimental design called a pilot study. So the pilot study, you need to say what it is and how it is going to control things, and you need to make sure you talk about it in relation to this particular study. You can't just talk about pilot studies in general. So you start off by saying what it is. So a pilot study is a small-scale investigation that tests the materials and procedures to control for extraneous variables. Extraneous variables are nuisance variables that may influence the DV, which is our accuracy of recall, or eyewitness testimony, which means we wouldn't know if it's the anxiety medication causing the eyewitness testimony score or the extraneous variables. So that's what it is. And then you have to say like what you would test in a pilot study in this particular investigation. So what materials and procedures in this investigation would influence the DV. So a pilot study would test the video of the violent crime to check it has suitable content, is the right length of time, is the correct volume, and that the equipment works, so like no buffering, which could all influence the DV. So the pilot study is getting rid of any nuisance variables. So if the video was too long, supposing it was like an hour, people would just get really bored and switch off and lose concentration. So the pilot study is checking all of those things, that all of those things are really correct and are not going to influence the DV. Then you would go on to say it would also test that the questionnaire accurately tests accuracy of eyewitness testimony and has the correct number of questions, so participants do not get bored or guess answers. So you're testing the questionnaire as well. That's what a pilot study would test. Now that's a really good control measure, and you can use it like a pilot study for any experimental design. The other thing you can use as a control measure for any experimental design are standardized instructions. So standardized instructions as a control measure are a set of instructions read aloud to participants before the task begins. They are written as a script. So you said that that's what they are. And then you need to say what they control. So standardized instructions reduce investigator bias and investigator effects because all participants will get the same instructions delivered in the same way, not allowing the investigator to give subtle clues or cues to one group of participants about what is expected. In this experiment, the investigator might encourage the anti-anxiety medication group to really focus on the details of the crime, which could improve their recall. Now, the thing with investigator effects is that sometimes it's done on purpose by investigators, and sometimes it's done unwittingly, like they don't realise. But either way, if you've got standardised instructions, then it will control for that because everybody gets the same instructions. Just to say, if you only choose standardised instructions as your control measure, you won't get full marks on that section. It's not enough. And that leads us on to the next slide. What's going on? Okay, so control measures. Like the first thing I said was that your control measures will usually depend on your experimental design. There are specific controls for specific experimental designs. So for independent groups, the control measure is random allocation. And if you're one of my students, when you think about that random allocation tin, what does it do? And what's it for? If you're not one of my students, then sorry. But the random allocation tin is just where you put everybody's name into the tin, shake it all up, and then randomly draw names out of the hat, out of the tin, and you allocate them to conditions of the IV until they're all used up. So you want to be talking about that. So if you decided in your designer study you were going to choose independent groups, then you would say the control measure for independent groups is random allocation. Now, that is always the case unless it's a quasi-experiment. So do you remember a quasi-experiment is where you can't randomly allocate people because you might be looking at the difference between like smokers and non-smokers. Now, that's not the case in this experiment. We are going to randomly allocate people to either take anxiety medication or a placebo, so it's going to work. So participants are randomly allocated to the conditions of the IV by drawing names out of a hat or the lottery method. So you're saying what it is. And then the justification is this will spread the individual differences or participant variables between the conditions of the IV. Now you must include relevant participant variables for this study. So you would say, for example, their baseline anxiety level, educational achievement, or their memory in general, etc. And so that's how you're controlling for those things. It spreads them across the conditions of the IV. If you had chosen to use a repeated measures design earlier in the study, then you need to identify that the control measure for repeated measures is counterbalancing. So counterbalancing controls for the order effects of boredom, practice, and fatigue. It's achieved through the ABA procedure. So participants are randomly split in two, and half do condition A followed by condition B, and the other half do condition B followed by condition A. So you're showing that you understand that the conditions that you do the IV could influence the DV. The other control for this particular study is that there must be 2 videos of a crime, otherwise participants will already have seen the video in the first condition and do better the second time around. So they must therefore match the 2 videos of the crime as closely as possible. For example, the length of the video, the number of people in it, the nature of the crime, so that one is not easier to recall than the other. And so with repeated measures, counterbalancing is the one that you have to talk about. But in this particular study, because it's looking at a video of a violent crime, you also have to talk about those 2 videos being matched to control for practice. If you chose match pairs design, then there's not an awful lot to say about the control measure for that. So the first thing is make sure, if you chose repeated measures, then definitely talk about the pilot study because there isn't an awful lot to say about the controls for match pairs. The only real control for match pairs is to randomly allocate each pair to conditions of the IV, and that will avoid investigator bias because even though they've been matched on all these personality variables, they still won't be identical. The other thing about controls the last thing you can do is just like general controls for this particular investigation. So general information about how to keep everything the same for all participants. So in this study, for example, having the same room, lighting, seating and equipment for all the participants, which could influence the DV, and you can credit all relevant general controls. So, phew, that is the end of section 1. Section 1 is the longest, really. So then I would do another subheading, section 2, materials, apparatus, procedure, describe the task, procedure and any specialist materials required. So first I would identify the specialist materials required, and when you're identifying those materials, think of it like a shopping list. So what would be needed so that the experiment can take place? What do you actually have to physically have in order to carry out the experiment? And so here you can write it as a bulleted list. This is the only bit where you can, but I'd still write a sentence to say the specialist materials that I would require include, and put a colon, and then we've got some ideas, and this will, obviously vary depending on the experiment you're doing. So for us, we've got video of a violent crime, or 2 videos that have been matched if repeated measures design, a video player, screen, speakers, anxiety medication and glasses of water, a comfortable room to show the video, appropriate seating to show the video, questionnaire to test the accuracy of recall, pens, and it says there, credit any other relevant specialist equipment. So whatever you're being asked to do, think about what physical things would I need to carry out this experiment. Then you're going to talk about the procedure, which is the task. It says describe the task and the procedure. So for full marks in this section, the procedure should relate to the IV and the DV. The answer will be dependent upon the experimental design that you chose earlier. It's got to relate to the stimulus, so it must include taking anxiety medication for one of the conditions of the IV and taking a placebo or no medication for the other. It's also got to relate to generating an eyewitness testimony score, so the procedure should include that a questionnaire to test accuracy of recall will be used. Now, depending on the type of experimental design you chose will alter the procedure. So first of all, if you chose independent groups, then you should include the following information. So you should include that participants should be randomly allocated to conditions of the IV by drawing names out of a hat, to allocate half the participants to take anxiety medication before watching a video of a violent crime and half to take a placebo before watching the same video. The video will be 10 minutes long. Now I've put there, except anything from 5 to 30 minutes that is realistic. So choose a time. I think 10 minutes is probably maybe even too long, but anything from 5 minutes to 30 minutes is acceptable. If you said the video is like an hour, it's unrealistic and I think you would get marked down. So just be realistic. Then after 48 hours, all participants will return to fill in a questionnaire to assess their accuracy of eyewitness testimony. These scores for both conditions of the IV will be compared to test for a difference in the accuracy of eyewitness testimony. If you chose a repeated measures design, then it's going to be slightly different because you're going to have to talk about what those participants will do. So all participants will complete both conditions of the IV. So they will watch 2 videos of a violent crime, one having taken anti-anxiety medication and one having taken a placebo or no medication. Participants will be counterbalanced to avoid order effects of boredom, practice and fatigue, so they will be randomly split into 2, and half will do condition A followed by condition B, and half will do condition B followed by condition A. So you're giving that procedure of the ABA procedure, the counterbalancing. Then the same, after 48 hours they come back and do the questionnaire, and then again the scores will be compared, but these scores for the conditions will be compared to test for a difference in the accuracy of eyewitness testimony. If you chose a matched pairs design, then it's slightly different again. So participants will be matched for appropriate criteria such as baseline anxiety score, age, gender, educational attainment, memory in general, etc. The people with the closest scores will be matched into a pair. Each pair will be randomly allocated to complete one condition of the IV, either with anti-anxiety medication or a placebo or no medication. Participants will watch the same video of a violent crime. After 48 hours, they will all return to fill in a questionnaire to assess their accuracy of eyewitness testimony. These scores for both conditions of the IV will be compared to test for a difference in eyewitness testimony score. Okay, so section 3. So just to reiterate, in section 2, your procedure will be dependent upon which experimental design you chose. So you don't write all of those. You just, if you chose independent groups as your experimental design, then you write the procedure as if people are doing an independent groups design. Okay. So the last part, it says data analysis that could be used include reference to descriptive and inferential analysis. Now, in my experience, most people forget to do descriptive statistics. They go straight for inferential. So start with your descriptive. So you're going to say, to describe the data set, I'm going to use measures, a measure of central tendency and a measure of dispersion, because those are the two descriptive statistics. And you need to justify it as well. So you could say, because it's ordinal data, they should ideally choose the median and the range, and can use the fact it's ordinal data to justify it. Or you could just say that the median gets rid of anomalies, extreme scores, and that the range is quick and easy to calculate. So your measure of central tendency in this first pale box is the median. And all it says is, what would you use? So the median gives you the middle score, it gets rid of anomalies, and we're using it because we've got ordinal data. Or you could just say, I've chosen the median because it gets rid of those extreme scores and it's quick and easy. And the range, which is your measure of dispersion, is quick and easy to calculate. Now, ideally, you should be choosing the median and range because it's ordinal data, but don't worry, if you decide to go for the mean as your measure of central tendency and the standard deviation as your measure of dispersion, that's fine. You just need to justify why you've chosen those things. So the mean is the most sensitive measure of central tendency as it includes all the scores, and the standard deviation is the most sophisticated calculation that shows how closely clustered the scores are around the mean, so it's less distorted by extreme scores than the range. You could argue that. So as long as you say that you're going to describe the data set using measure of central tendency, such as the mean or median, and a measure of dispersion, such as range or standard deviation, and justify the one you've chosen, that will be fine. The last thing you need to do is say about inferential statistics or inferential analysis. So it's important to say, to test for significance, I will choose an inferential statistical test. Now, I haven't put that on the slide, so make a note. So in order to test for significance, I will use an inferential statistical test. And the inferential stats test you choose is going to depend on the experimental design you chose. So if you chose independent groups, then you're going to say, I would select a Mann-Whitney test because, and then you give 3 reasons. It's a test of difference, and you might say between taking anti-anxiety medication or a placebo. It uses ordinal data, which is the eyewitness testimony score, and it's independent groups design. If you chose a repeated measures design or a matched pairs design, then you would say I would choose a Wilcoxon test because it's a test of difference between taking anti-anxiety medication or a placebo. It uses ordinal data, the eyewitness testimony score, and I used, and then say which experimental design you chose. So, and I chose a repeated measures design or a matched pairs design. Don't write both because you only chose one earlier. So whichever one you chose, you say that's why. And that is it for everything that you need to write. Now your job now, what you've just done is called revision in. You've watched this video, hats off to you, it's pretty long. You are feeling really confident, you're like, yes, I can write a designer's study, this is great. So you've had all of that knowledge that has gone into your head. What you need to do now for your exam technique is to do the revision out. Now, if you're one of my students, you know what that means. Revision out means that whatever's in your head, you need to put onto paper. So that means you've got to write the designer's study from scratch. So I've put the stimulus there again for you, and just do everything that I've talked about in the study. Now I'm going to write a model answer for this. If you're my students, I'll put it in Teams with the designer studies. If you're not one of my students, then I will put a link in the description below this video where you can click on the link and get access to the model answer. But do the revision out, because that will help your exam technique. And the last thing to say is keep it simple. If it's an experiment, Supposing it said, design an experiment to test the influence of dancing on mood. Does it affect your mood? Then we're looking at, like, the conditions of the IV are people who dance and people who don't dance, and the dependent variable is the mood score. Like, just do a mood score from 1 to 10. That's the easiest thing to do. And so have a go at writing experiments on really simple things. Like the one I've given you is about, like, does taking medication or not influence your eyewitness testimony score? But like I said, it could be, does dancing improve your mood? Or it could be, does using a mobile phone in a driving simulator make you have more errors? So practice writing a designer study. Use these bullets, but if you're my students, there's loads and loads of practice questions. So on the specimen past papers that I've written, you'll find loads of designer studies at the end of each, like, paper, and the model answers as well. So just, you know, practice it, have a go. The more you do, the more confident you will feel, and the more you'll want there to be a 12 marker, and you'll be like, yes, I'm ready for this. So good luck. I hope it goes well, and well done for getting to the end of this video.